For more than a century, the story was simple. Joseph Stalin was Georgian. Born on December 18, 1878, in the small town of Gori, nestled in a valley where the Lyakvi River meets the Makvari, he was the son of a cobbler and a house cleaner, raised in poverty, educated in a seminary, transformed by revolution. His origin was the foundation of every biography, every documentary, every official account. Textbooks repeated it. Museums enshrined it. It was settled history. There was nothing left to question. But a DNA test on one of his grandsons quietly produced a result that doesn't match the story we were told. The genetic signature it revealed doesn't point to Georgia at all. It points to a completely different people, a people whose ancestors once rode across the Eurasian steppe on horseback, a people whose bloodline connects not just to the mountains of the Caucasus, but to something far older. Something that reaches back thousands of years, to the very first farmers who ever set foot in Europe. And perhaps the strangest part of all? Stalin himself, the man who personally crushed the science of genetics, who imprisoned and killed the biologists who studied DNA, may have carried in his own body the answer to a question his regime made it illegal to ask. This is that story. To understand why the DNA result matters, you first have to understand how completely the Georgian identity of Stalin was accepted. Not just accepted, cemented. From his earliest biographies to the official Soviet histories, the narrative never wavered. Joseph Vissarionis Yughashvili was born Georgian, raised Georgian, spoke Georgian as his first language, and carried the identity of his homeland into the Kremlin. His birthplace in Gori was turned into a museum. His childhood home was preserved under a grand Italianate pavilion, a shrine to the humble origins of the great leader. The town itself seemed to confirm the story. Gori sat at the heart of the Kartli region, one of the ancient kingdoms of Georgia. Its population was overwhelmingly Georgian and Armenian, with small numbers of Russians, Abkhaz, and Ossetians scattered among them. Roughly 7,000 people lived there when Stalin was born, and the town had grown in importance after a branch of the Trans-Caucasus Railway connected it to Tiflis and the major port of Poti in 1871. To the outside world, Gori was as Georgian as a place could be. Stalin's father, Bessarion, was a shoemaker. His mother, Ekaterine Galadze, cleaned houses and did laundry for local families. The family name, Yughashvili, carried the Georgian suffix shvili, meaning child of or son of. On the surface, everything about this family appeared to be rooted in Georgian soil. But beneath that surface, there were whispers, and those whispers had been circulating for a very long time. Throughout his life, Stalin heard rumors that his paternal grandfather was not ethnically Georgian. The name in question was Zaza Yughashvili, born around 1780, a serf who worked the vineyards of Prince Badur Machabeli in the village of Didi Lilo, about 16 kilometers from the capital, Tiflis. Zaza had fled there after participating in the failed 1804 Mtiuleti rebellion against the Russian Empire. But where had Zaza come from before that? Historians Simon Sebag Montefiore and Ronald Grigor Suni both suggest that Zaza may have originated from the village of Geri in what is now South Ossetia. Montefiore, one of the most respected Stalin biographers alive, could not prove the claim definitively. But the circumstantial evidence kept accumulating. Start with the surname itself. Yughashvili ends with the Georgian shvili, yes. But the root, juga or juga, has no clear Georgian etymology. One theory, advanced by scholar Mikhail Vyskopf, traces it to the Ossetian word dzug, meaning herd or flock of sheep. Before the revolution, it was common practice for Christianized Ossetians in South Ossetia to write their names with Georgian suffixes. The surname Jugayev remains common among Ossetians to this day. Strip away the Georgian ending, and what you have left looks distinctly Ossetian. There were other clues. Stalin's father, Vissarionon, was himself described as Ossetian in some accounts. The town of Gori sits just south of the border with the disputed territory of South Ossetia, a region where Georgian and Ossetian communities had intermixed for centuries. The peoples of the Caucasus had moved around for generations, and ethnic boundaries were never as clean as later nationalists wanted them to be. And then there was the poem. In 1934, the Russian poet Osip Mandelstam composed what has been called a 16-line death sentence. The Stalin epigram attacked the dictator with a savagery that stunned everyone who heard it. Mandelstam described Stalin's fat fingers like grubs, his cockroach whiskers, his laws flung like horseshoes at the head, the eye, or the groin. And in the final devastating line, Mandelstam called Stalin something very specific. Not Georgian, not Russian. He called him the broad-chested Osset. Mandelstam was arrested, exiled, and eventually died in a Gulag transit camp near Vladivostok in December 1938. His body was thrown into a common grave, but his words survived. And the question embedded in that final line, the question of whether Stalin's blood ran not Georgian, but Ossetian, never fully disappeared. It simply waited for a technology that didn't exist yet. Now here's where we need to understand who the Ossetians actually are, because this is where the story deepens in ways that nobody in Stalin's time could have predicted. The Ossetians are not just another Caucasian ethnic group. They are the sole surviving descendants of the Alans, a branch of the ancient Sarmatian and Scythian nomadic confederacy that dominated the Eurasian steppe from the Balkans to Mongolia for over 1,000 years. They speak an Eastern Iranian language, distantly related to Persian, which makes them a linguistic island surrounded by Caucasian and Turkic-speaking peoples. Their traditional culture preserves rituals that scholars trace directly to Scythian practices described by Herodotus more than 2,400 years ago. Post-funeral banquets, horse dedications at burials, a warrior aristocracy built around horsemanship and clan loyalty. Richard Foltz, a professor of religions and cultures at Concordia University, has called the Ossetians the last remaining linguistic and cultural descendants of the ancient nomadic Scythians. The Scythians, those legendary horse archers who terrified the ancient world from the 7th century BCE onward, left no written records of their own. But they left gold. Extraordinary gold jewelry found in Kurgan burial mounds across the steppe, depicting animals in violent motion, horses rearing, deer leaping, predators tearing into prey. That artistic tradition, that relationship with gold and with horses, survived in the culture that eventually became the Alans. The Alans arrived in the Caucasus after being pushed from the steppe by the Huns in the 4th and 5th centuries. They built a medieval kingdom, Alania, that became a regional power, controlling passes through the mountains and growing wealthy from Silk Road trade. At its peak, the Alan kingdom was strong enough that the Byzantine Empire recognized it as an independent allied state. Then the Mongols came. In the 13th century, the invasion shattered Alania, and the survivors retreated deeper into the mountain valleys, where they maintained their language, their customs, and their genetic identity through centuries of isolation. By the 16th century, Georgian landowners were bringing Ossetians south across the mountains to work as serfs in what is now South Ossetia, further blending the populations of the region. That genetic identity is remarkably distinctive. Modern studies, including work by Ivan Nasidze at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, have mapped the Y-chromosomal DNA of Ossetian populations. The results are striking. Among North Ossetians, haplogroup G dominates the male lineage. In the Dagora subgroup, it reaches an extraordinary 74%. Across all Ossetians, roughly 70% of males carry haplogroup G2, specifically a subclade designated G2A1A1A1A1A1B, which has been identified in Alan-era burials from the Saltovo-Mayaki culture along the Don River. Before we see what this evidence reveals, if you're finding this discovery as fascinating as we are, Subscribe so you don't miss future stories like this one. Now hold that genetic signature in mind, because it's about to connect to a very different test, conducted on a very different person, in a very different context. Alexander Burdonsky was a Russian theater director, the eldest son of Vasily Stalin, who was himself the son of Joseph Stalin, and his second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. Burdonsky spent most of his career directing plays at the Moscow Theater, and in 1996 he was awarded the People's Artist of Russia Award. He was, by any definition, a confirmed biological grandson of Joseph Stalin. At some point, Burdonsky's Y-chromosomal DNA was tested. The Y-chromosome passes virtually unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, which means that Burdonsky's Y-DNA was, for all practical purposes, identical to that of his grandfather and his grandfather's father and his grandfather's grandfather before him. The paternal line runs unbroken. The result landed in genetic databases without fanfare. No press conference, no documentary crew, just a set of STR marker values and a haplogroup classification. Stalin's Y-DNA haplogroup was G2A1A. Specifically, the subclade designated FGC595 and Z6553. And his STR marker value combinations, the specific repeating patterns that act like a genetic fingerprint for paternal ancestry, clustered with one population above all others. Not Georgians, not Russians, not any of the broader Caucasian ethnic groups. Ossetians. The highest concentration of this specific haplogroup anywhere in the world is among the North Ossetians, where G2A1 variants represent up to 32% of all male lineages. Among South Ossetians and the Svan people of western Georgia, significant G2A1 presence has been documented as well, though precise percentages have not yet been fully quantified. Elsewhere in the Caucasus, the frequency drops to negligible levels. Outside the Caucasus entirely, it's effectively absent. What this tells us is precise and unavoidable. The patrilineal ancestry of Joseph Stalin, traced backward through the Y-chromosome across centuries, aligns not with the Georgian populations among whom he was raised, but with the Ossetian populations whose roots stretch back to the Alan warriors of the medieval steppe. The whispers in Gori. The etymology of the surname. Mandelstam's final fatal word. They were all pointing in the same direction. DNA simply confirmed what rumor had preserved. But the story doesn't end with the Ossetians, because haplogroup G2A carries a much deeper history, and that history connects Stalin to a chain of human migration that spans not centuries, but millennia. Haplogroup G, defined by the mutation M201, is thought to have originated in Western Asia roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Its subclade G2A spread into Europe beginning around 8,000 years ago, carried by the first Neolithic farmers migrating from Anatolia and the Near East. These were the people who brought agriculture to a continent of hunter-gatherers. They carried wheat seeds, herded domesticated sheep and goats, built the first permanent villages, and transformed the landscape and the human populations they encountered. They moved through the Balkans, along the Mediterranean coast, and up through the river valleys of Central Europe. Wherever they went, their Y-chromosome signature went with them. How do we know this? Because their bones have been dug from the earth, and their DNA extracted and sequenced. And the results are remarkable in their consistency. In Neolithic burial sites across France, researchers found G2A in 20 out of 22 male remains. In Spain, 5 out of 6. In Germany, 11 out of 13. Not a single haplogroup R, the lineage that dominates European males today, appeared in any of these early farmer populations. 0. The first Europeans to plant crops, to build villages, to create the foundations of settled civilization on the continent, were overwhelmingly men carrying haplogroup G2A. And then there was the most famous G2A carrier of all. In 1991, two German tourists hiking at an elevation of 3,210 meters on the Austrian-Italian border stumbled upon a body emerging from glacial ice. Wetzi the Iceman, as he came to be known, had been frozen in the Alps for approximately 5,300 years. He carried a copper axe with a U-handle, a quiver of 14 arrows, a chert-bladed knife, and an arrowhead embedded in his left shoulder. Someone had killed him. His body was so well preserved that researchers could identify his last meals, his tattoos, his diseases, even the specific parasites in his gut. In 2012, his Y-chromosome haplogroup was confirmed as G2A-L91, a subclade within the same broader G2A family as Stalin's lineage. Their specific subclades differ. They are not direct relatives, but they share a common deep ancestor who lived thousands of years before either of them was born. In fact, in 2013, researchers in the Tyrol identified 19 modern men living in the same alpine region who still carry Wetzi's exact paternal lineage, G2A-L91. The line persists, diminished, isolated, but unbroken. Wetzi carried the blood of the first farmers. And so, in a different branch of the same ancient tree, did Joseph Stalin. This is where the irony becomes almost unbearable. Around 4,000 years ago, new populations swept into Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. They carried haplogroup R1b, and they brought with them horses, bronze weapons, wheeled vehicles, and a pastoral warrior culture that would reshape the continent forever. Within centuries, they had largely replaced the Neolithic farmer lineages across most of Europe. The scale of this replacement was staggering. In some regions, the incoming steppe populations contributed up to 75% of the male ancestry within just a few generations. G2A, once the dominant Y DNA of Europe, was pushed to the margins, surviving at significant frequencies only in isolated refugees where geography offered protection from the demographic tide. Sardinia, separated by sea. Corsica, similarly insulated. And the Caucasus Mountains, where the sheer height and inaccessibility of the valleys created natural barriers against mass population movement. A 2025 study published in Nature Communications by Valentina Coya and colleagues examined 47 prehistoric individuals from the eastern Italian Alps, spanning from 6,400 BCE to 1,300 BCE. Their results showed extraordinary genetic continuity. Most individuals had 80 to 90% Anatolian farmer ancestry, maintained for over 2,000 years. The Alps had functioned as a genetic stronghold, holding on to original Neolithic lineages even as the rest of Europe was transformed. The Caucasus did the same thing. While G2A was being swept away across the European plains, it persisted in the mountain valleys where populations remained relatively isolated. The Ossetians, descendants of the Alans who themselves carried diverse but Caucasus-concentrated lineages, maintained this ancient genetic signature through the centuries. The very isolation that preserved Alanic language and culture also preserved the DNA. What survives in those mountains today is a living genetic archive of a world that has otherwise vanished. So when we look at Stalin's Y-chromosome, we're looking at a lineage that survived two massive demographic replacements, the Neolithic farmer displacement in Europe and the Mongol destruction of Alania by retreating into the same mountain range both times. A lineage of survivors. And there is a second DNA story that deserves to be told here, because it reveals not just ancestry, but the hidden human wreckage of Stalin's personal life. In 1914, Stalin was exiled to the remote Siberian village of Kureyka, a settlement of fewer than 100 people living in 8 wooden cottages above the Arctic Circle. The nearest town of any size was hundreds of kilometers away. In winter, temperatures dropped to -40. It was meant to be a punishment so severe that escape would be impossible. There, at the age of 35, Stalin began an affair with Lydia Pereprigina, a 14-year-old orphan girl who was one of 7 siblings, all orphaned, all living together in the village. Lydia became pregnant. The first child, born in late 1914, died in infancy. The villagers were scandalized, and local police reportedly intervened, trying to force Stalin to promise marriage once Lydia reached the legal age. He agreed. He would later break that promise without a second thought. A second child, Alexander, was born on November 6, 1917, the day before the Bolshevik Revolution that would carry Stalin to power. He was already gone from Kuriga by then, swept into the chaos that would remake the world. Lydia married a local fisherman named Yakov Davidov, who adopted Alexander. She worked as a hairdresser, had 8 more children, and decided not to speak of Stalin. She buried the story. Stalin knew the boy existed. According to some accounts, he allegedly tried twice to bring Alexander to Moscow, but they never met. Alexander served in the Red Army, fought in the Manchurian campaign against the Japanese in 1945, reached the rank of major, and died in 1987. A soldier who had lived and died without ever knowing his biological father's legitimate family. His son, Yuri Davidov, grew up in Novokuznetsk, became a construction engineer, and lived as an ordinary Siberian pensioner. In the early 1970s, when he was about 20 years old, his parents sat him down for what they called a serious conversation. They closed the door and told him the truth. His grandfather was Joseph Stalin. "How did I take this?" Davidov later recalled. "Pretty easily. The world did not turn upside down." For decades, he kept quiet. Then, in 2016, at the age of 67, Yuri Davidov submitted his DNA for testing. Alexander Burdonsky, Stalin's acknowledged grandson through Vasily, provided the comparative genetic material. The result came back with 99.98% certainty. Yuri Davidov was confirmed as Joseph Stalin's grandson. "All I wanted is to protect the good name of my grandmother and parents," Davidov told reporters. "Members of my family had been accused of being imposters for years." The DNA didn't just confirm a family secret. It closed a loop that had been open for a century. But there remains an irony so sharp it almost cuts. During the very decades when this genetic evidence might have been gathered, Stalin was waging war against the science that could have revealed it. Beginning in the late 1930s, Stalin threw his personal support behind Trofim Lysenko, a biologist who rejected Mendelian genetics entirely. Lysenko claimed that acquired characteristics could be inherited, that one plant species could transform into another through environmental conditioning, and that the entire concept of the gene was a bourgeois fabrication. He insisted that wheat seeds exposed to cold and moisture could dramatically increase yields, a process he called vernalization. To a Soviet state reeling from the catastrophic famines caused by forced collectivization, a man who promised agricultural miracles without accepting the constraints of actual science was irresistible. Under Stalin's protection, Lysenko's ideas became Soviet state doctrine. The consequences were catastrophic and far-reaching. More than 3,000 mainstream biologists were dismissed or imprisoned. Research institutes were purged. Textbooks were rewritten. The very vocabulary of genetics was censored. Nikolai Vavilov, the president of the Soviet Academy of Agricultural Sciences, and one of the greatest geneticists of his era, a man who had traveled 5 continents collecting seeds to protect the world's agricultural diversity, was arrested in 1940. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to 20 years of imprisonment. He died in prison in 1943 of starvation. In the very country he had spent his life trying to feed, the man who had assembled the world's largest seed bank starved to death in a cell. Stalin personally edited Lysenko's speeches. He signed off on policies that set Soviet biology back by a generation. Research and teaching in genetics, cell biology, and neurophysiology were banned or crippled across the entire Soviet Union. Soviet scientists who privately noticed the great advances in molecular biology happening in the West, including the characterization of DNA itself, could say nothing publicly without risking their careers or their lives. And all the while, running through Stalin's own cells, encoded in every nucleus, was a Y-chromosome carrying STR markers that could have told him exactly where his father's line originated, exactly which ancient population had produced him, exactly which migration patterns had carried his ancestors across continents and through millennia. He destroyed the science. His body contained the evidence. The man who made it illegal to study heredity was himself a walking testament to what heredity reveals. The debates are far from settled, and responsible scholarship demands we acknowledge the limits of what DNA alone can tell us. Some scholars question whether Zaza Jugashvili was truly Ossetian or simply lived in an Ossetian-adjacent area. Stephen Kotkin, another major Stalin biographer and professor at Princeton, writes that Zaza may have lived in a trial Ossetian village, but stops short of confirming ethnic identity. The distinction matters. Living among Ossetians and being Ossetian are not the same thing, especially in a region where populations mixed across ethnic lines for centuries. The Georgian suffix on the surname could mean a fully Ossetian family adapting to Georgian naming conventions, or it could mean a Georgian family that happened to live near Ossetians and picked up a local word. The Y-DNA tells us about the paternal line and only the paternal line. It says nothing about Stalin's mother, Ekaterina Galadze, whose ancestry appears firmly Georgian. It says nothing about the dozens of other ancestors who contributed to his autosomal DNA, the full genetic portrait that includes both parents, all 4 grandparents, all 8 great-grandparents, and every generation before them. A person's complete genetic identity is not defined by a single chromosome. Stalin could have been predominantly Georgian in his overall ancestry while carrying an Ossetian paternal line, the same way a person in modern America might carry a Y-chromosome tracing to Scandinavia while being predominantly of English, German, and Irish descent. There are also the persistent rumors about Stalin's paternity itself. Kotkin notes that several men in Gori were suggested as possible biological fathers. Local gossip circulated about Ekaterina's alleged affairs, with candidates including a local wine merchant, a priest, and even, in the most fanciful versions, visiting Russian aristocrats. Montefiore entertains the possibility, but ultimately concludes that Bessarion was probably the father, in part due to a strong physical resemblance between father and son. Kotkin agrees, noting that reliable evidence about the possible liaisons of the future Stalin's mother is lacking. If Bessarion was indeed the father, then the Y-DNA result applies directly. If he was not, then the entire Ossetian connection through the Jugashvili surname may be irrelevant to Stalin's actual biological ancestry, though it would raise an entirely different set of questions about who his real father was. What is not in doubt is the haplogroup itself. G2A1A, subclade FGC595. A lineage whose deepest roots trace to the ancient Near East, whose branches once covered Neolithic Europe, and whose modern concentration centers on the mountains of the Caucasus and the descendants of the Alans. The STR marker values don't lie. They cluster where they cluster, and they cluster with the Ossetians. If this hidden chapter of history intrigued you, subscribe to explore more mysteries the evidence is only now revealing. Today, in the city of Gori, Stalin's childhood home still stands beneath its grand pavilion. Visitors walk through the modest rooms, read the plaques, and leave with the story they came for, the story of a Georgian cobbler's son who rose to rule an empire. It's a clean story, a human story, a story that fits on a museum wall. But somewhere in a genetic database, a string of STR marker values tells a different story. It speaks of Scythian horsemen riding north of the Black Sea, of Alan warriors building a kingdom along the Silk Road, of Neolithic farmers crossing from Anatolia into a continent they would transform, of a frozen man in the Alps, an arrow in his shoulder, carrying the same ancient mark in his chromosomes, and of a dictator who banned the very science that would one day read the evidence written in his blood. Stalin's Y-chromosome connects him to the oldest farming lineage in European history, a lineage shared with Witsi the Iceman, concentrated today among the descendants of Scythian warriors, and nearly erased from the continent 4,000 years ago. If a single chromosome can carry that much history through one man's veins, what else might modern genetics reveal about the leaders who shaped the world we live in?